colleague, Professor Yu, who was the pioneer in the field of isotopic transient, and also John of the laboratory at the university. One interesting aspect of this approach, which is perhaps less pursued, is what happens to the oxygen under reaction conditions, and in particular, what influence may they have on the surface. There's been a little bit of work done in the past related to that. A number of studies at the Brigham Young University and also working at Goodwin. And basically, this was primarily under very high concentrations of high concentrations of water. And so one thing that we wished to look at was what influence water had, or let's say the oxygen being removed from the carbon monoxide, what role it might play on methylation. Obviously, under the typical means written for fuel hydrogenation, we have some adsorption of CO, which can either be dissociated to give a certain carbide plus a free oxygen, which later undergoes hydrogenation, or perhaps one might propose some sort of highly consistent CO dissociation, resulting in no aqueous or even other mechanisms which hypothesize oxygenated formation, which originally dealt with eliminating water. In addition, oxygen could play a role in terms of oxidation of the sun's surface, especially at high partial pressures of water. Now, there's a number of questions that we might wish to ask. First of all, is water, when formed during the reaction, able to reabsorb and participate in other reactions? In addition, can water that is reabsorbing or act to modify the active site for the CO hydrogenation? And then there are other questions which I won't get to here today, and which are very difficult to answer. That is CO dissociation assisted by hydrogen, and does methane formation easier for the oxygen? Those, again, are answers now, so I'll address the first two. Just to remind you what the steady-state isotopic transient analysis is all about, we proposed that I think Professor Bell also used this morning. Basically, it's the switching between isotope reaction mixture, and following the decay of one of the isotopes, or the isotope that is switched. That can be, the curve can be tipped. One can get a residence time for the intermediate on the surface out of that, which is the inverse is related sort of to the first order rate constant, and the area under the curve is rate per time gives a concentration of surface intermediate containing that particular element into the particular molecule. The conditions that we were operating under was a nickel powder, plug flow differential reactor, about 2 atmospheres of pressure, and these other things I'll mention a little bit later, but high gas, our space velocity. We'll be using hydrogen CO ratio 3 or 24 for weeks without using. The switches that we carry out are the 6 number switching between either labeled carbon, labeled oxygen, hydrogen material, and labeled water also. This is a typical plot. I won't dwell on it just to show you roughly the kind of data that you get out of it. That is a 13 became 13 CO to 12 CO. And you notice the following water oxygenated steam. That's a freebie that we get because of the impurity of oxygenated steam in the CO13. Okay. Due to limitations in the system, in particular passing analyzing the reaction mixture via capillary inlet into the mass spectrometer, we couldn't go to very high partial pressures of water vapor. However, so what we decided to do in order to try to get as high an impact of the water vapor as possible on CO elimination, was to decrease the partial pressure of CO. We went down to about 5 kilopascals, and keeping the hydrogen more or less constant, so we had a ratio of about 24. As it turns out, you can see the effect of going down in CO particle pressure. Basically, the concentration of CO on the surface drops by about 40%, and that modifies the residence time on the surface due to the fact that it's probably more of the stronger side. The methanation or the methane concentration on the surface also decreased 2.6 to 1.2. That drops the surface residence time of those intermediates. However, the turnover frequencies remain pretty constant as opposed to higher CO particle pressure. The water on the surface stays more or less constant at about 5 or 6 micromoles per gram of catalyst. That's water from reaction. You'll notice, which is typical of efficient process catalyst, that the amount of methane intermediates on the surface is much greater than that of water. And that's typical. Now, so we reduced the partial pressure of CO so that our relative effect of water is greater. We actually did the work at also higher partial pressure of CO, and there seemed to be no effect of the added water on either methanation or either the surface concentration of methane or the surface concentration of CO. As we decrease the partial pressure of CO, what we see by adding going from 0, so the partial pressure of the water added to 0.45 kilopascals, we see a approximate 30% drop in the surface concentration of CO. The surface concentration of methane was not affected, at least, nor was its residence time or the concentration of water from reaction on the surface, however, dropped from 5.2 to 1.6. The concentration due to water added went from 0 to 12.9 micromoles per gram of catalyst. The total number of moles on the surface dissipating satellites so went from about 20 to 25. This is a composite of multiple switches, but under steady-state operation of the catalyst with high partial pressure hydrogen, so that there is one thing, obviously, we're not getting an effect on the methanation rate, the surface coverage, and the methane intermediate and its residence time. But is there any possible modification in the site distribution of reactive intermediates? This is more or less the way the data is collected, is a fraction of the steady-state rate for methane containing particular isotope carbon. This is without added water. This is with added water. Obviously, you can't tell by looking at these whether they're on. If you take a logarithm plot to get a little better view of things, except you still can't distinguish between these two, you obviously note that by virtue of the curvature in this log or semi-log plot, that the surface of this nickel powder is quite heterogeneous. It's homogeneous sort of in terms of native site. This would be first one. Now, the technique that Professor Bell mentioned earlier this morning was published last year made by the Constance Silva and Bell deals with a sort of inverse transform analysis of data. And what you get, in effect, is a sort of distribution of the, let's say, the reactivity of the active intermediate, perhaps you can relate that to sort of slight distribution. And what you see here, which is dependent on fuel hydrogenation catalyst, you have a very large number of low activity, let's call them sites or intermediate surfaces, and a few very active ones. We now take these two plots. This is with added water, without added water. Again, it's hard to see much here because for those active sites, the areas in the background. If we multiply this by the pseudo-vertical rate constant, we get a little more of a distribution of activity relative to the rate constant. And what you can note from here is, in fact, that the addition of small amounts of water is not modified the methanation on the site by any determinable amount. Now, the more dramatic effect, however, can be seen on this plot, which is the residence time of water on the surface as a function of partial pressure of added water. The top curve shows that surface. This is the residence time of added water in the absence of CO, and you see it goes to the 200 seconds, the last 100. As you add more and more water, the residence time falls on or the residence time on the surface falls using competition for the cathode fuel. The second curve is added water during reaction, and you see that's much lower, significantly lower, usually just added water in the absence of CO. And then finally, the lowest curve is, and again, these are curves only for the eye, they're not particularly stable to trust exact location. The lowest curve, if you will, is that for water reaction. You can see that's greatly affected by the presence of added water in space. The dotted line is that for the count of the residence time of methane or methane surface intermediate. And you can see that if you go in the absence of the added water, there's a difference in division. There's a tremendous difference in the power of water versus the power of methane. But in reality, they're much close together. Whether this actually approaches that of methane or not, we have not yet determined. It perhaps does, or perhaps it's below all. Okay. This sort of this schematic gives an indication of what we are seeing in our results. With hydrogen and CO coming into the reaction zone, there is, of course, CO exploding on any site where methanation is not occurring. It may or may not dissociate, and probably in most cases will not dissociate. It also finds those active sites where it undergoes hydrogenation, oxygen gets removed, and water gets eventually formed. You get desorption of methane, water into the gas phase. Methane is, of course, inert for these systems and passes out of the reactor. The water, though, has a much more interesting history after this formation. It can reabsorb on the surface, and in reabsorbing, it can actually exchange its hydrogen. And once it can reabsorb, in fact, probably multiple times, but it can also be blocked by other waters or from the surface where it may receive out. What doesn't happen is under CO hydrogenation, when CO is present, there is no indication that the oxygen can ever go back into recombining the carbon with carbon monoxide. So finally, the conclusion that we state are that water molecules readily absorb the reabsorb of decontamination conditions at 200 degrees centigrade and higher. That any count that one measures under the normal type of using the normal technique is really a residence time for data formation as well as the residence time for reabsorption. We've been doing quite a bit with ammonia synthesis here. This is very crucial to the primary product, the reabsorption. At low partial pressures of water vapor, say less than about 25 per gallon, water has little or no effect on the acid contamination site, but competes for water absorption. The hydrogens that absorb water readily exchange, but they do not appear to be defined on hydrogen except in the absence of CO. The oxygen of the water also does not, under these conditions, react with organic species on the surface, but rather stays in the water form as it's reabsorbed again. And this is possibly because of the fact that it's adsorbing on those less active sites rather than the sites which are the most interested. At very high parts, this is sort of extrapolation, if you will, or a suggestion that we may have in terms of the high partial pressures of water. What is probably happening when you get to maybe 80% of the gas stream or something like that of water vapor, you can certainly compete with hydrogen for absorption on the active site. It competes with CO for absorption and on the inactive site at the lower partial pressures, but at high partial pressures. So, in addition, it may cause resurfacing of the metal surface. Certainly, as you get the hydrogen concentration in the mix into regions where hydrogen plus water may be oxidizing the air surface. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge that my support I thank you.
The paper is open discussion from the audience. Please proceed to the microphone.
Ben, that's on you. That's very interesting work. Shows the water has little effect on the carbon on the surface.
At low partial pressure.
Partial pressure. But I have a question. The shape of the oxygen transmission is a convex on the shape of the distortion, like that seen for CO, and which is described as the manifest effect. If that's true, then the resonance time would depend on lowering the constant water pressure. Is that what it's
In this series of experiments, we kept the flow rate constant. But what you're saying is absolutely true, and that is it's a tremendous chromatographic effect for this water. It likes to reabsorb. It may even reabsorb multiple times. And certainly you would modify that by stepping up the flow rate. I think that if someone is interested in the oxygen trajectory under these conditions, say, pursuing other things, maybe whatever. I mean, certainly one thing that one has to consider is all the reabsorption steps. You help yourself out by going to a high flow rate and probably to what we've gone to with ammonia synthesis, which is more of a PSPR.
for the isotopes.
Well, nitrogen 15 minutes, absolutely 5 times more expensive.
Shots.